I hope that you are well and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 7, and then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. All right. So we see our chapter is simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. And our subject is English language arts, grade 7. And the lessons that we are focusing on under the chapter is to identify dependent and independent clauses, and we're also going to answer the question, is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound complex, right? So that is going to be our lessons for today. All right. So when it comes to a simple sentence or a compound sentence or a complex sentence or even a compound complex sentence, then we first have basically, let's say, a group of words, right? And a group of words we call a clause. And a clause, right? We say it is a group of words and it contains both a subject as well as a predicate. So a clause is a group of words that contains both subject and it contains a predicate, meaning it contains tells us who or what is doing the action as well as the action that they're doing. And the predicate is out, it's the action or the verb. Right? And when it comes to a clause, right, we have independent clauses and then we have dependent clauses, right? So we have a dependent clause and we also have an independent clause. So an independent clause, right? If you think of a person that's independent, right, it means that the person is doing his or her own thing, they're on their own, right? It's like they don't need people. Let's put it like that. So an independent clause, it basically shows a complete thought, right? And when it comes to an independent clause, right, which is a complete thought, and then it can stand on its own. So an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence. So it can stand on its own as a sentence. It does not need any other sentences in order to, let's say, assist him to show a complete thought, right? So an independent clause, it is a complete thought and it can stand alone as a sentence. And then we have a dependent clause. Dependent clause. And a dependent clause, right? It is not a complete thought. So a dependent clause, it does not show a complete thought at all, right? And when it comes to a dependent clause, it cannot stand alone as a sentence, right? It needs either another sentence in order to assist that sentence in order to show a complete thought. It's not even to show complete thought, but just for the sentence to be complete. Right? And if we look at an example, right? It says, let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. So let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. And this means that this clause can stand alone, right? This clause can stand alone, and we call this an independent clause. This is an independent clause. And then if we look at this next one that says, after Kevin gets off work, this is a dependent clause. Why? Because now they're not saying what's going to happen after Kevin gets off work, right? It just says after Kevin gets off work. That's it, right? So that is a dependent clause and it cannot stand on its own. It cannot stand alone, right? So once again, we have a clause, and we have a clause is a group of words that contains both subject as well as predicate. And we have an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And an independent clause, it is a complete thought and it can stand on its own. And then we have a dependent clause, right, which is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence, right? All right. Now, once after that, then we have a complex sentence. We're gonna go into what a simple sentence, compound, as well as a compound complex sentence is. So when it comes to the different types of sentences, right, we have a complex sentence. All right, let's before we go to a complex sentence, let's do this. All right, let's start by a simple sentence, right? So we have different types of sentences. We have a simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, as well as a compound complex sentence, right? So a simple sentence, it is made up of a single independent clause. And remember, we said an independent clause can stand on its own, right? For example, Ben and I spent all day relaxing by the pool, which means that a simple sentence which shows an independent clause, right, has both subject as well as a predicate. So our subject is Ben and I, and our predicate is spent, or you can say spent all day by the pool, right? And then some of our simple sentences, they have introductory phrases, right? It's not all, but some of it, they have introductory phrases. But the introductory phrases is part of the predicate, right? And the predicate is, like we said, it is it's your verb, right? So we say in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat. So in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat, right? So here it says Ben usually wears his heavy coat, right? And that is basically our, let's say, our phrase, right? But the introductory phrase is in the winter, right? And the next one says Ben usually wears his heavy coat. Then we have a compound sentence, right? So a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses. So it's two independent clauses that can stand on its own, but it is joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as the word and, but, or so. And that's an independent clause. And an example of a compound sentence is we saw the flash of lightning, and seconds later, we heard a rumble of thunder. So the word and, so the word and over there, that is our coordinating conjunction. And that is what we call a compound sentence. And a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses, right? And remember, we said an independent clause is it's a clause that can stand on its own, right? And it contains both subject as well as a predicate. And a compound sentence, like we said, is made up of two independent clauses, and that two independent clause we join together, right? And we join it with or by using a coordinating conjunction, such as the word and, but, or so. Those are conjunctions that joins that words, right? So that is basically simple sentences as well as a compound sentence. Now we're going on to our complex sentence, right? And when it comes to complex sentences, then a complex sentence is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause, right? So a complex sentence is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And remember, we said an independent clause can stand on its own, and a dependent clause cannot stand on its own. All right. So the dependent clause is in the complex sentence. It usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. And remember, there's a difference between subordinating conjunctions and there's a difference between coordinating conjunctions. And a subordinating conjunction, right? It includes words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, as well as while. And then we have also a relative clause because we see the dependent clause within a complex sentence. It either begins with a subordinating conjunction or it begins with a relative pronoun. Right? So, and a relative pronoun, it includes words like which, whom, who, whom, or whose, right? That is a relative clause. All right, and an example of a complex sentence, right, is let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe after Kevin gets off work. So let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe after Kevin gets off work. Which means that these two sentences are put together, which is the independent clause as well as a dependent clause, right? However, this is our independent clause. Let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. And then this one, which I'm going to underline with red, is our dependent clause. After Kevin gets off work. And after, right, is a subordinating conjunction. Right? It's a subordinating conjunction. So our subordinating conjunction, we said, or let's say our dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction, which is after. Then we have another sentence which says, during his trip to Italy, Tony visited the Trevi Fountain, which is in Rome, right? And if we look at this sentence, right, this sentence contains a relative pronoun, and the relative pronoun within the sentence is which. That is our relative pronoun. Right? So basically, we mentioned we have simple sentence, we have a compound sentence, and so far we've mentioned our complex sentence. And we see the simple sentence is made up of a single independent clause. An independent clause can stand on its own and it has both subject as well as a predicate. And then we have a compound sentence, and we say the compound sentence is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And the coordinating conjunctions are words like and, but, or so. And then we have a complex sentence, and a complex sentence is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause within that complex sentence, right? It usually begins either with a subordinating conjunction, which is words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, and while, right? Or the dependent clause within that complex sentence can begin with a relative pronoun. And relative pronouns are words like which, who, whom, or whose, right? Those are relative pronouns. And then we had made a few examples of simple sentences, compound sentences, as well as complex sentences, right? All right. So far, this is our different types of sentences, which is simple, compound, complex. And we are also going to find out more about compound complex sentences, right? And we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca. So now we're going to aplusstudents.ca and we are going to do the first lesson, which is to identify dependent and independent clauses. All right, so we said once again that a clause is a group of words that contains a subject as well as a predicate. So clause contains a subject as well as a predicate, right? And when it comes to clauses, then we have an independent clause and we have a dependent clause, right? So we have an independent clause and we have a dependent clause. And an independent clause, it basically shows a complete thought, and it is a sentence that can stand on its own. That is a clause, right? An independent clause, sorry. And then we also have a dependent clause. And a dependent clause is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. Right? And then we also mentioned a complex sentence, and we said a complex sentence, it is made up of an independent clause, as well as a dependent clause, and we said that the dependent clause within this complex sentence, it either begins with a subordinating conjunction or it begins with a relative pronoun. All right. So now we're going to our test, right? And in this test, we are going to identify the dependent as well as independent clauses. It says, the first sentence is, the hand, a 4-inch unit of length, has traditionally been used for determining a horse's height, which is measured from the ground to the top of the horse's withers or shoulder areas. We need to select the independent clause. Or is it the hand, a 4-inch unit of length, has traditionally been used for determining a horse's height? So we need to say if it's the first option or the second option that is an independent clause that can stand on its own. And if we choose an independent clause, we will choose the second option, right? Which is the hand, a 4-inch unit of length, has traditionally been used for determining a horse's height, right? Now we need to select the dependent clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence, right? It either starts with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. It says some farmers prefer organic fertilizers because they enrich the soil and are free of harmful chemicals, right? So the dependent clause is that some farmers prefer organic fertilizers because they enrich or because they enrich the soil and are free of harmful chemicals. We need to select the dependent clause. All right, and we choose the dependent clause. We'll say it's because they enrich the soil and free harmful gases. So the second one is correct. We need to select the dependent clause, the dependent clause that cannot stand on its own. Usually the dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. All right, it says as America's cotton production dramatically increased in the early 1800s, the demand for slave labor has intensified. So we need to say if it is the dependent clause, is it as America's cotton production dramatically increased in the early 1800s, or the demand for slave labor also intensifies or fied. So we need to select the dependent clause. All right, and we select the dependent clause And we can say as Americans' production dramatically increased in the 1800s. All right, we need to select the dependent clause. The dependent clause. Before he became the 39th president, Jimmy Carter had been a naval lieutenant. Oh, I've never heard of that. And a peanut farmer. Naval. Oh, a naval lieutenant. Sorry. A naval lieutenant and a peanut farmer. So we need to say which one is the dependent clause. Is it before he became the 39th president? Or Jimmy Carter has been a naval lieutenant and a peanut farmer? All right, and if we select the dependent clause, we're going to say before he became the 39th president. All right, let's do the last one. We need to select the independent clause. Independent clause. And the independent clause, right, it says if a word is spelled the same forward and backwards, for example, civic, rotator, radar, kayak, or deed, right? It is known as palindrome, right? So it is known as palindrome. So now we need to say which one is a independent clause, right? Is it if a word is spelled the same forward and backwards, or it is known as palindrome? We need to select the correct independent clause. So it is known as palindrome, or if a word is spelled the same forward and backwards. All right. So we can say it is known as palindrome. Right? Now we're going to, is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound, complex, right? And we already see that the clause is a group of words that contains both subject as well as a predicate, right? And an independent clause, we said, is a complete thought that can stand alone as a sentence. And a dependent clause cannot stand alone as a sentence, and it is not a complete thought, but an independent clause is a complete thought, right? And then we have simple sentences, and we said a simple sentence is made up of a single independent clause, right? And then we have a compound sentence, and a compound sentence is made up of two independent clauses. And remember, we said independent clauses can stand on its own, and it is joined by a coordinating conjunction such as and, but, or so. And then we have a complex sentence, right? And a complex sentence is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And remember, we said an independent clause can stand on its own and it shows a complete thought, and a dependent clause does not show a complete thought and it cannot stand on its own. So the dependent clause within a complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, right? And subordinating conjunctions include words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, and while. And a relative pronoun includes words like which, who, whom, or whose, right? And then we also have a compound complex sentence, right? So compound complex sentence. Already a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And a complex sentence, we said it is an independent, it's made up of an independent and a dependent clause, right? But now we have a compound complex sentence. And a compound complex sentence, it is made up of two or more independent clauses, right? And one or more dependent clauses. So, for example, after Samantha left, right? After Samantha left, that is already a dependent clause. She stopped at the bank, that is an independent clause. And then she went to the gym, right? So it is made up of either two or more independent clauses or one or more dependent clauses. So there we have two independent clauses and one dependent clause. And also when it comes to compound complex sentences, right? Sometimes a dependent clause in a complex or compound complex sentence can interrupt an independent clause, right? By saying AUKUS, it's like somebody's name, that are kept in captivity. Okay, not AUKUS, it's not somebody's name, but kept in captivity often have bent dorsal fins, right? It's an animal. So that are kept in captivity is a dependent clause, and the way it's interrupted is by adding the name of that, for example, fish, AUKUS, right? So that is the different types of sentences, right? A simple sentence, a compound sentence, complex sentence, as well as a compound complex sentence. And we said a clause, we have an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. All right, so now we need to say which type of sentence this is. Annual plants survive only once and must be replaced each year, but perennials return each year with new flowers and foliage. So we need to say which type of sentence this is. Is it a complex sentence or compound sentence? So annual plants survive only one season and must be replaced each year, but perennials return each year with new flowers and foliages. And if we say the type of sentence that this is, let's say, yes, is annual and must be replaced each year. Let's say it's a compound sentence because it is joined by coordinating conjunctions. All right. Lorraine Hansberry wrote the wildly acclaimed 1959 Broadway play A Raisin in the Sun, and her accomplishment opened the door for other African American playwrights. We need to say this is a compound sentence or a simple sentence. So, compound sentence or a complex sentence. All right, and if we choose which type of sentence this is, and we can say this is a compound sentence and it is joined by coordinating conjunction, which is and. All right, we need to say which type of sentence this is, right? Kyle always approaches difficult tasks enthusiastically, and he frequently motivates others with his energy and fervor. So we need to say if it is a simple sentence or a compound sentence. All right, so we can say this is a compound sentence and it is joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is and. All right, so we need to say if this is now a complex or compound sentence. The weather forecast had predicted severe thunderstorms, but the dark, heavy thunderclouds never materialized. So the weather forecast had predicted severe thunderstorms, but the dark, heavy thunderclouds never materialized. And if we say what type of sentence this is, then we can say this is a compound sentence because it's joined by the coordinating conjunction but. All right, so now we need to say which type of sentence this is. It says Diego took several incredible panoramic photographs of the sweeping views from the top of Table Mountain. We need to say this is a simple sentence or if it is a complex sentence. And if we choose the type of sentence, then we can say this is a simple sentence. All right. Okay, so that is now the end of our lesson on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences, right? We said firstly that a clause, it is a group of words that contains both a subject as well as a predicate, right? And then we have independent clauses and we have dependent clauses. And an independent clause is a complete thought that can stand on its own as a sentence. And a dependent clause does not show a complete thought and it cannot stand alone in a sentence, right? And then we have a compound sentence, right? And a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses. And it's made up of that two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And then we have a complex sentence, and a complex sentence is made up of a independent clause as well as a dependent clause, right? And the dependent clause within that complex sentence either starts with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, right? So that is now the end of our lesson grade sevens on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I really hope that you are going to have an amazing evening further. Goodbye.